Picture this. You show up to view a one-bedroom apartment, nothing special, small kitchen, some noise from the street, and 40 other people show up for the same viewing, and you never even hear back. Does it sound familiar? Here's the relief. It's not because you're bad with money or too picky or drinking too much coffee. Well, that joke needs to die already. Something structural shifted in the housing market, and once you actually understand what changed, it stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling like a puzzle you can work with. So today, let's walk through what changed with real examples from the US, Europe, and Australia, and why this is more manageable than it feels right now. First, let's ground this in reality rather than doom scrolling energy. Yes, the numbers are tough. In Lisbon, the average home now costs close to 19 years of income to buy outright, and Sydney's price to income ratio is one of the highest of any major city on the planet. But here's the useful reframe. These numbers explain why renting well, saving smart, and building wealth through other means isn't a consolidation price anymore. It's just a completely rational strategy in the world as it actually exists right now, not the world your parents grew up in. Knowing the why behind the numbers is what lets you stop comparing yourself to a generation that played a different game. So what actually shifted? Three forces, and understanding them is genuinely useful, not just interesting trivia. First, supply patterns shifted. A lot of what's been built lately is smaller units, while family-sized homes lagged behind. Portugal is a clear example. The country built somewhere around 25 to 30,000 new homes a year, while most estimates say it actually needs closer to 45 to 50,000 just to keep up. That gap is a big part of why Lisbon got so expensive so fast. Part of the wider issue comes down to zoning, the rules controlling what can be built where, and the encouraging part is that this is actually one of the most fixable pieces of the whole puzzle. Cities that have loosened zoning restrictions in the last few years have already started seeing more housing supply come online, which is a good sign that policy changes here can actually work relatively fast compared to other economic fixes. Second, there is the cheap money hangover. For most of the 2010s, interest rates sat near zero, so people who bought back then locked in incredibly cheap mortgages. When rates rose, a lot of them simply stopped moving rather than trade a 3% mortgage for something at 6 or 7%. Instead, many rented their old places out, which tightened up both the resale market and the rental market at once. The genuinely good news here is that this effect naturally fades over time. As rates stabilize and more people eventually do move for life reasons, that lock-in pressure gradually loosens on its own. Third, tax policy in some places has quietly nudged the market toward treating housing as an investment first and a home second. Australia's negative gearing rules are the clearest example, letting property investors write off rental losses against regular income. But this is also where you can see real momentum. Starting in 2026, Australia is restricting that benefit to newly built homes only, which is a genuine, concrete policy correction happening in real time, not just talk. And that's really the through line across all three regions. Governments are not ignoring this. Australia went after the tax incentive directly. Cities across the US are experimenting with zoning reform city by city, and some of those experiments are already showing measurable results in the new housing supply. Europe doesn't have one unified fix, but individual countries are trying real things: rent support programs, construction subsidies, and in places like Portugal, a growing public conversation about closing the gap between homes built and homes needed. None of this fixes everything overnight, but it's worth knowing that this issue has genuinely become impossible for policymakers to ignore, which is usually the first real step toward things actually improving. Now, the part that matters most isn't really about spreadsheets, it's about how people are living. It's true that milestones like marriage and home ownership are happening later than they used to, both in the US and across Europe. But I'd push back gently on the idea that this is purely a tragedy. A lot of people are also using these years differently, building careers, investing earlier through other means, being more intentional about where and how they eventually settle down, instead of following a script that assumed a house was the default starting point of adult life. The timeline shifted. It didn't disappear, and economists themselves aren't even fully agreed on how much of this delay is really about housing versus broader life choices changing anyway, which is a good reminder not to treat your own life as a behind schedule just because it doesn't match a decades old pattern. So if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. None of this happened because you did something wrong, and none of it means that door is closed. The market changed because of specific, identifiable forces like supply choices, interest rate cycles, and tax incentives, and specific, identifiable forces can also be addressed, which is already starting to happen in places like Australia and in individual cities rethinking zoning. Understanding why this happened won't change your rent next month, but it does mean you get to make your next financial decision from a place of clarity instead of self blame, and that genuinely is worth something.